we have this misconception that when we are dying, that it is our death, when in fact our dying belongs to other people, because they are the ones who will carry the experience. They are the ones who will carry the energy and emotion. They are the ones that will have to navigate life after we've died. And so can your death be of service? Can your death be in service? We are all going to die. Like, I don't know about death and taxes, because there's plenty of businessmen who bypass taxes. They've found ways to get around taxes, right? They're not getting around death. And so that's the one thing that we do truly all share. And the question becomes, can we see it as this thing to fight? Or can we see it as this thing to share?
The Tom Screen podcast is owned and made possible by Ethical Marketing Service. If your business is struggling with Google or Facebook ads, maybe you're frustrated figuring it out, or there's a performance issue, Ethical Marketing Service has worked on hundreds of accounts and we can help in this area. We offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you would like to find out if we can help, it's a free, no salesy consultation call, and the link is in the description. Enjoy the episode. Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. On the episode today, we have Paul Simard. Paul, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It is great to have you. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm somebody who doesn't like to put labels on anything that I really do. I have several hats, but primarily what I see myself as doing is being a mirror, a guide, and someone who can help other people to more deeply and fully embody what they want to be and how they want to show up in the world. And I do that in a wide range of different ways. I do a lot of one-on-one work with individuals, with men primarily. I support organizations in thinking about some of the more soft parts of their workflow, if you will, things like mental health and wellness and those kinds of things, as well as doing some things that are a little bit more off the beaten path, if you will. I'm a certified death doula, and I actually believe that our relationship to death is one of the key drivers behind our mental dis-ease in these times. So, especially coming out of a pandemic.
Well, there's a lot to ask you about there, and I got a whole list. But what would you say that your passion is in relation to the things that you like to discuss?
Yes. So my passion is always a moving target, and I think that's one of the things that has allowed me to show up in the way that I do. But really, I just stated it, and that's to say that I'm passionate about service. I'm passionate about being in service. And right now, my deepest curiosity is around this relationship between how we are showing up in the world in a wide range of things and death. I really do feel like it is the primary driver. But again, if it doesn't start with mental health, for me, it doesn't start. So really, that's the thing. But where the crosshairs of my focus will be, that will change from time to time. And right now, it just happens to be around death.
Well, those are three great topics. But the Grim Reaper is something which I don't find. I've spoken to many people and looked at many profiles and had many pitches for people to be on the podcast. I don't recall anyone saying, I want to talk about death. And that's a very interesting thing in and of itself. So in terms of what you have learned about death as a start, as a summary, what would you share with me or the audience?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's the fact that nobody else has ever wanted to talk about it, right? Like, why is it this thing that nobody wants to invite into the living room as a topic of conversation? And some of it is going to be that I think death's PR firm has basically been on vacation for the last 100 years, certainly. And when it has stepped up, it hasn't shown up in the best ways, in the sense that it comes up through, a pandemic, which is fear driven by, medical institutions and all these things. And not that there wasn't things to be concerned and to be fearful of necessarily, but that's when death came into our sights, if you will, is through these things. You even used a word, I mean, or you gave it a name, the Grim Reaper. There's nothing overly flattering about, that as a moniker to be walking around the world with. And so,
That was an attempt at humor, is all I'd
oh,
say there.
but it was also a well-placed attempt at humor, and it was A, funny, and B, very apropos for your question, right? Because it is so true. Our labels and the way that we view death, it goes in two extremes actually. So it's either this massively heavy, dark and foreboding thing that nobody wants to talk about, or we make light of it, right? And some examples of that are the playful way that we might describe it, the Grim Reaper, or so on and so forth. But also, even when I think of like, we die every day, or if you had 3 days left to live, what would you do with them? These don't actually address the the breadth and the importance of the subject of death. Inevitably, you ask somebody what do they want to do with the last 3 days of their life, and they're going to come up with a bucket list of things. Well, I'm going to go and climb Kilimanjaro. I want to go, and I've always wanted to drive a race car. Blah blah blah, whatever the thing might be. And yet, when you actually spend time with people who are in the last 3 months of their life, none of those bucket list things show up. And if they do, they're things that are on a bucket list that was just recently created when the news of their imminent death entered the room. It's things like, I want to go and I want to spend time in the garden. I want to go and I want to hold my grandchild as often as I can. They become these mundane day-to-day things that become the things that they really want to do with their remaining time. And so the most important thing that I have learned is that we actually are in a time where we are being invited to reintroduce and almost reclaim death as a very normal and natural and actually awe-inspiring part of our experience as people. It really truly is. And I'll take a breath in a moment, but I'll just finish by saying, awe and fear are actually variants of the same energetic emotion. And it's only what happens in our brain that is the difference between whether we are in awe of something or in fear of it. There's going to be things like experience and things like that, but I can be in complete awe about the same things that I might fall into a deep fear about. And death is one of those things.
I'm interested to know, based on your answer, how you react to death, given the fact that you have thought about it a great deal. Because I think the default response to death, whether it be, let's say, close friends or family, for example, is I suppose reactive in the sense that everyone sees it as a negative thing. How do you deal with it personally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And I'm going to use a very personal experience because I'm coming up on the 1 year anniversary of my mother's death. She died in November 2022, survived by my father. And there's I believe, now his name is escaping me, but there's an actor who I recently heard talking about his own experience with his mother's death. And he says, I'm one of the strange people. I actually love talking about my mother's death. And when I heard that, I was like, yeah, I'm like that too. And I've only really come to be able to articulate the why of it in the last sort of month and a half or so, I would say. And my mother's death was actually certainly the last, but potentially even the most beautiful gift that a mother could give to their child. My mother allowed me to be very intimately close to her death and dying process. She was very comfortable, and it's because she knows that I'm a death doula, and that because she knows that I'm I'm not, these things will affect me, but they won't traumatize me in the way that society uses the word trauma right now. Um, I, I'm I'm I was deeply curious about what she was feeling and what she was experiencing. Um, I I tried to lean into that expression of awe. And, I was with my mom basically 24/7 in the palliative care residence where she eventually died for the last 4 days of her life. And I got to experience everything from the those moments of recognition when she's back in her body and my mom is has re-entered the room, to the moments of complete confusion where she's not really sure what's going on and what she's experiencing, to, and this is a little bit of a harder one to share, but to the death rattle that literally carried on for 8 hours all night until such time as they changed her seating position. And so um my experience with death, and there's something, I think losing any parent is really hard for us. I think that losing a mom uh is especially so, assuming that the relationship with the mother is one that is whole and is more or less nourishing, because we experience what we in the Western civilization consider to be the opposite of the thing that they gave us. And so there's that sort of last fiber of connection with our mother is truly broken, and truly severed potentially. I actually don't usually speak of my mom in the past tense. We've actually decided to keep her at home as opposed to having her in a columbarium, in a glass case in the urn and the whole 9 yards. Her urn is here in my parents' home, which is where I work from, which is where I'm speaking to you from today.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Very nice to sort of share that experience with you, if you will. I should have followed up on something which you said earlier, which was you said that you were am I right in saying a death doula? Is that correct?
Yes, a death
So I
doula.
should have
Yeah.
said, what is that?
Yeah, great. Another great question, and one that has as many answers as there are death doulas in the world, which is to say about 30. No, I'm kidding. There's many more than that. My own attempt at light humor. So a death doula can, however, show up in a variety of ways, and it depends on how that death doula chooses to fill that role. Um, there's the death doula who will actually, like a birth doula will actually sit and guide and support the dying person, once you've typically gotten what they would call like a palliative care protocol. And so the dying is very, very imminent, and they will support that person in navigating that. Everything from very practical things like, making sure they won't necessarily do the estate pieces and things like that, but just making sure that those are pieces that they're thinking of. If they're going to be doing any kind of religious service or those kinds of things, that could also be part of that side of the equation. Other doulas might do that and also support the family as they begin to, get in front of their grieving process, and start to prepare for the death of the loved one. So that is also something that doulas can do. You also have doulas, and this is where I do spend most of my time, who are more interested in normalizing and, like I said earlier, reclaiming conversations around death and bringing them back into the mainstream, so that we create a healthier relationship with death as a part of the experience that we have as humans. And part of the reason that I'm really focusing on that is because the the work with families or with dying people is still something that most people are not, um, they don't feel like they need in a lot of cases. Um, we have what I call the death or the dying industrial complex, which tends to make people feel as if they're taken care of, right? So you get ill, you go into the hospital, the diagnosis becomes terminal, you go into palliative care, you die, you go into, the funeral home, and then depending on your religious beliefs, once you've done the church and the funeral home thing, well, God's got the rest. So we don't actually have to do anything in the whole thing. And it's a very convenient system, most of which is very profitable up until the person has actually been either, put in the urn or died. And so this sense that one might need a death doula to support them is not quite there yet. Um, and so, and you need permission, obviously, from the family, and then, obviously death doulas need to make a living as well. And so there might be financial restrictions and so on. And the idea of paying for these things for some people is that's not something they're comfortable with yet either. On the other hand, I don't necessarily need anyone to invite me in the room for me to be able to create spaces to advocate for a healthier relationship to death, so that death doulas either become a more natural part of the way that we are living, or so that at least we're challenging some of the ways people think about it at the very least, so that they on their own can be their own death doula to a certain degree as they're experiencing death in their lives, just through conversations or other things like that. So um, I do podcasts. I come on and I talk like we're doing today. Every month I host a Death Over Coffee, which is an event at a local coffee shop here. And we get together as a group and we talk about death and dying. And you know, again, just to tie it in, I have seen people's mental wellness improve through these conversations. Where a man who 6.5 months ago, 7 months ago, when he first started coming to our Death Over Coffees, was living in deep anxiety. He's an older gentleman. Death is probably not imminent. He's you know early 70s, I would say, so potentially lots of years ahead. But deathfully afraid of death, like deathly afraid of death. And he sent me an email not 2 or 3 weeks ago, sharing an article that he read. And he was like, "This was really interesting." And he goes, "And I've just realized that death is now very much a part of my life." Like the stress and anxiety relief that I could sense from his words is why I believe that it's such an important part of our mental health and wellness.
Well, congratulations for that. I think anytime that you're doing something which relieves stress and anxiety over something major, I think that's doing good work. So well done.
Yeah.
It does bring me to, I mean, normally I would never ask this because I don't know. I think you probably know why, but because of what you do, what are your thoughts around what happens after death?
Yeah. So a very interesting and a very challenging question. And my short answer is I don't think it matters what I think. I think, and I mean that honestly. My personal opinion is that a belief is very different than from something that we know. And so what I'm more interested in is making sure that whatever someone believes that I work with, who I work with, or who I'm sitting with in conversation, that it serves and supports and nourishes them. That is the most important thing. Now, I don't want to bypass or avoid your question by getting, or get myself off the hook by not answering the question. But in my work, that is more important to me than me projecting or sharing my belief. And that's not what the goal is in terms of what I'm going to share right now. Um, I'm a firm believer that, in fact, and there's many indigenous or intact cultures that still believe this to this day, although it's not quite as prominent as it used to be. But many cultures don't actually have the concept of death. as something that is in their vernacular. It's not in their experience. It's all life, including what we now call death. And if you were a member of an indigenous community, an Intact community here where I am in North America, in Canada, and you were an elder person and you were in the middle of migrating from one area to the next, and winter was approaching, and you came to recognize that because of your age, you were potentially putting the life of the community at risk. It took no more than a hand on the shoulder of your son or maybe your grandson, depending on how old they were, and you would go together into the woods, and that would become your ceremonial burial place. As you quote unquote gave your life, although there's no sacrifice in their mind, in support of life. For them, it was that's just all life. And what's beautiful about that, of course, is that the family will always know where the bones of that ancestor are. And so it creates a relationship to the land as well. I'm much more of that belief. So I'm much more of the belief that everything is in support of life. When I die, I would love to be, depending on what regulations come into play between now and my actual death. We are also, even the way we're buried today is regulated and bound by law, right? They're changing and they're expanding, but I would love to be potentially wrapped in a mushroom suit and laid at the foot of a young oak or other beautiful tree, and have my body contribute to that in support of life, because that's what death actually should be. When you look at the earth in a potted plant or in a garden, that earth is made up of generations of things that have died before. And while we don't necessarily associate in that way, that includes people, right? There's actually, parts of the DNA of people that is found in that earth. And so death is in fact necessary for life. It is absolutely necessary. And if we can, my hope, and we're probably many generations away from this, if ever, but my hope would be that we can start to reclaim that as a part of how we contribute to the broader health of the planet. Because as it stands, and it is getting better, as I said, but as it stands, we are the only creature on the planet who, upon their death, for the most part, doesn't contribute to the future life of another entity. But everything else, when it dies, contributes in some way. We'll put in metal containers, in glass boxes, in marble walls, as I said. And again, I do believe that if we can reclaim that relationship to death, that it will help us to come to a more comfortable, although I don't like the word comfortable, but a healthier relationship with our own mental health and wellness. I truly, deeply believe that.
Thank you for sharing that. Just out of interest, I'd like to know whether or not you get some. You're in a scenario where very tense scenario potentially with family members. Do you ever get a hard time from anyone?
Yeah, sure. I'm blessed with a bit of an odd family where these kinds of conversations are a bit more normalized than you might find them otherwise. But again, my goal is not to tell anyone what they should and shouldn't do. I don't actually know anything. I have a certain set of beliefs that I share my experiences through, and they're constantly evolving. Um, And so when there is a tension point, for example, my brother has a very different relationship. As I said, my mother's urn is in the home. When I come, most days I'll go and I'll lay my hand on the urn and I'll wish her good morning and ask her how she's doing and all of these things. Um, my brother believes that it's just a pile of ash that used to be my mom that's in a metal container. That there's no one to speak to there. And that's fine. That's his belief. I don't. There's no conflict. There's no confrontation. There's no challenge around that. Right. Um, the the test of our beliefs will come at the time of our own death. That's that's when it matters. Right. What we do now doesn't necessarily matter, but when our death is at our door, is sitting next to us, that is where I will be curious to see how each of us might navigate, not knowing how even I myself will do so. Um, because it's very different to be with other people's death than being with your own. Um, and so I have plenty of opportunities through which I could get into a conflictual conversation, but I don't think that that serves and supports anyone. And I feel the same way when I'm in circle with people or in conversation with you today.
And is there a theme of the type of person that wants to have you present as a death doula, or can it be pretty much anyone?
I think it can be pretty much anyone. As I said, most of my time is spent in circles and in opportunities talking and writing about it. What's really been interesting to me, actually, over the last sort of 4 or 5 months is we have about 20 people that come to these circles. We try to keep them intimate. We want them to feel as though they have an opportunity to share if they want to. And what's been interesting is that almost half of those people, and I don't ask for their actual age, but based on, you know, looking at them and hearing their experiences and where they are in their lives, are under the age of 35. And they don't always have someone in their life who is dying. They are quite often thinking about their own death. And more importantly, what that means for their life. And so it's really interesting to me to see that when we open these spaces that I don't want to say that they're the first, but I'm going to say it in that way just to say that they're the most prevalent group, but they're the first to put their hands up when it comes to an invitation to have these conversations. The people who are in the minority are actually the people who are sort of at the height of their professional and personal lives, if you will, 35 to kind of 50, where I'm guessing things like children and career growth and all of these other things um, are the primary focus. And having just exited that window to a certain degree, I can also say that there's still that sense of it being way off in the distance, and maybe even a little sense, since I'm a male, identify as male and I'm cisgendered, a little bit of that invincibility energy too. They're like, yeah, that death thing only happens to other people, right? But as I've become more and more involved and engaged in this work, and I'll use an example that might surprise a lot of people, but there were a lot of they were not in the majority, but there were young people who died during the pandemic, as we obviously know. And I was always not surprised, but it was always interesting to me to note how that was the demographic that created the greatest outcry, right? If a young person died, well, we needed to bring masks back in school because if not, the governments are being irresponsible and so on and so forth. And there's this, even at one point, I remember a newspaper person here wrote that, is it okay that the politicians are saying that it's okay for kids to die from COVID, is how it was framed. And what's really lying under there is that it's not okay for children to die. And what that sort of leads you to start the question is, well, when does it become okay? Like, is there an age limit now? So it's not okay if you're, in primary school. Okay. Are we okay with it in high school? And if you ask most people, they're going to say, no, still not okay. 20 years old. And at a certain point, you get to like the 80-year-old and they're like, well, yeah, it starts to be okay. So what do? We go around to all the 80-year-olds and we start tapping them on the shoulder and saying, well, we're not going to put any energy and effort into you living any longer now that you've contracted this disease because you're 80 and that's, you've had your share. We're going to put all our energy over there. I have 3 girls. If anything were to happen, my heart would be destroyed, ruined. But that doesn't mean that it was wrong for them to die, or that their death is somehow more wrong than a 75 or an 80-year-old person. My mom died at 73. A lot of people say she was so young. Yeah, she was. In the general scheme of things, right? And especially where we are today in the world, she was. And I can tell you that my mom lived more life than a lot of people who survived to be 100, right? So that the notion of death at a certain age not being okay or being more wrong than another, I think this is also what some of those young people are being curious about, because they've seen other young people die in a more public sphere than they have before because of the exposure that COVID brought to this. And they're feeling something move within themselves, and they're curious to know what that is, which I think is beautiful.
You said in a previous answer about the fact that you don't know how you will be when you die. The question is, how do you suspect you will be?
Let me tell you how I quote unquote hope I will be. I so one of the most beautiful things, I hope I will be like my mom, to be honest. And what that means is I hope that it will give the people around me who want to lots of work to do. And there was a lot of work for us to do, which allowed us to be so intimate with her death. I'll give you some examples. She, when she got the diagnosis, one of the things she wanted was to come home for a week. Her life was her backyard. She loved this home, and she only wanted to go home for a week. Happy to share, she actually ended up with 3.5 months. But when she came home, one of the first things that my brothers and I did, and this was already a project, but it advanced the timeline. We tore down the old deck and we built a new deck in the back that was more amenable for her to be able to go out and sit in her backyard, right? So we did that in 5 days, something that probably would have taken, let's call it 8 to 10 normally, but just we didn't know the time. So we had that to do in the work. My brother and his partner had been planning to get married at some point. All of a sudden, that became something that everybody needed to get involved with now so that they could get married before my mother died. There was, she had a mission to all of the women and girls in her life that she cared about. We're going to get little pouches with mementos of hers, jewelry and earrings and things like that. She prepared close to 70 of those for us to distribute after she died. And we had to help with all that and going and getting the pouches and the cards and all of these things. And so there was a lot of work that came with it, but all of it was done with grace, right? And my mom was fortunate that she was able to have that kind of a timeline to do all of these things. Many people die suddenly. Many people die in tragic circumstances. Many people get the same prognosis as my mom, pancreatic cancer, and 3 weeks later they've died. But whatever the circumstances around my death, I hope that it is a death that invites people to be involved in it so that it can teach them something about what dying looks like, and maybe get a glimpse into their own.
Because you're going through something that you can share with someone else, which perhaps makes their process a bit better. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like there were some moments where it was really hard, and every, most deaths will have those moments where it's really, really hard, and all you want to do is look away, right? But the more that we can hold in our attention those messy moments, and we can normalize them, then our level of comfort is, raises, and our level of ease, more than comfort, raises, and the stress and anxiety and all these other things that as we've talked about, begins to kind of move through our body in a different way. I don't know if I can say that I'm not afraid. I can actually say, no, that's not true. I can say that I'm not afraid of death. I'm not sure I'm quite at the place yet where I can say that I'm not afraid of dying, because I don't know, again, the pain that I might be subjected to, the discomfort, the messiness that might be involved. I mean, we as humans, we have pride is, one of the sins, right? And there's two moments in our lives really where we can be pretty sure that our capacity to control our bowels and bodily fluids leave us. One is when we're very young, and we need diapers and things like that. But we're not at the point yet where pride is really playing a role. On the other hand, especially if we're dying from old age and those kinds of things at 75, 80, 85 years old, we've had a lot of practice with pride. And it can be very, very challenging for us to allow our loved ones to be a part of helping us to navigate those moments again. And with deep sadness, I would say, my mom was able to allow us in on some of those moments. And again, like I'm getting a little emotional in a almost in a positively sad way, but like I'm so grateful that she did. So grateful that she wasn't so stubborn that she needed the nurse instead, that she needed somebody else to come and do that work. We weren't there all the time. We didn't do it most of the time, but on the moments where we quote unquote had to because there was no one else around, she realized and recognized that that's what needed to be done in this moment.
Typically, if I was having a conversation that wasn't about death, I would, speaking to someone about their expertise, I would say, what are the mistakes that someone would make in this scenario? So I'm not going to ask the mistakes, but how would someone make the process of their death worse for them and others around them?
Well, I think you've already gotten a sense, and I think it's actually again, let's take it one step out. It's interesting to think that one level further out might be mental health versus death, which you would think is the bigger of the two subjects, but I'm actually going to say that mental health is the bigger of the two. But I think it's trying to keep it all to yourself. I personally believe that one of the saddest decisions that somebody could make when they know that their death is coming is to quote unquote do it on their own, or to want to die quietly when no one is around, right? It seems very noble. It seems very um, you know, generous towards those people who might find that person's death and dying challenging. But again, in fact, then what did your death actually serve? Did your dying actually nourish anything or anyone if you die in that way? And so, again, the more that we can, and it's going to be different for everyone, and there's no judgment on how much that is, but I just would invite people to try as to the capacity that they're able to share in their experience, right? Again, when it comes to stress, anxiety, I mean, one of the most mental, when someone's experiencing depression, when someone is experiencing fits of rage, and like the expression and the processing of that with people is one of the most cathartic things you can do. And I would invite through the notion that it is the same thing with death and dying. That dying and grieving, for those who are, with the or who have a loved one who is dying and or who has died, these are all things that are actually meant to be done in community. They are meant to be done with others. Um, that's my experience of it, and I I understand the noblesse oblige to do it on your own, but again, to what purpose? To what end?
You touched on a very interesting point because I think our conversation so far has been in the context of the person who is dying, but obviously they leave people behind. And do you help, or has anyone asked you for help in dealing with that process, the grieving, what we would call the grieving, quote unquote, process?
Yeah. So yes, and I think first and foremost is to understand that you know grieving is absolutely a set of actions, a set of things that we do, a set of emotions that we will feel. Um, to say that someone is feeling grief, um, or the grief that I feel, that doesn't really sit with me, because it can be so. You can be laughing and tears of joy and sharing in stories about the person who has died, and you know would you define that as grief, as feeling grief? I think grieving is a verb, absolutely, and I think it includes all of those things. And again, there's no right way to grieve, and there are definitely not 5 stages of grief that happen in a systemic and very, like, this is phase 1 and phase 2. There's a very famous book on this. And um you know grieving grieving is something that I think most people will do for the rest of their life. And someone's going to hear that and go, oh really? Like, they may have just lost somebody, and they're going to be like, oh no, I'm going to have to deal with this forever. The frequency with which you're going to experience the grieving, and that you will associate what you're doing with the dying person, and so it's part of your grieving, will more than likely become more and more spread apart, and the gaps will become more prominent, and the depth of whatever it is, happiness or joy, will maybe become more fleeting. But I believe that when we lose, oh no, don't like that word, when someone that we love dies, um, then we are gifted the capacity to grieve in meaningful ways for the rest of our lives, remembering that however much we grieve, the mirror reflection of that is how much we loved that person. And so embracing the grieving process is embracing the love that you had for that person. And so that's really what I try to lean, or invite people to lean into, in whatever way that looks for them. If that means you're going to, let's say the person decided to be buried, if that means going to the gravesite every single day and leaving a flower, or just, touching the grave, wonderful. Just absolutely do that. If it means you're going to be busy, 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 and you need to get right back into your life, I'm going to challenge you a little bit, but I'm not going to necessarily say you shouldn't do that. That's not helpful. That's not supportive, right? And so how we grieve, again, is going to be different for everyone, and there's no wrong way to grieve. My experience has been that the person, as an example, who is go, 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 isn't necessarily allowing for the space for that grieving to come in. And when they do, it does start to look like what other people do, air quotes for those who are listening. But that there are other people who just, their grieving is in their continuation of their life. And that's okay, right? Like, and we also don't know what happens behind closed doors when they're alone at night, when they're out in the woods on a walk, when they're whatever it is that they do on their own. We don't know. So the notion that grieving is supposed to look like any one particular thing is, again, it's a false start.
Actually, as soon as I said it, it reminded me of something you said at the beginning, which is a certain framing about how a process should be. So grieving obviously doesn't sound like a very positive thing. And I suppose, do you think that there is a social pressure to act in a certain way around grieving, so that people have to look like they are, I don't know, it's a negative thing rather than, I don't know if this is the right term, but maybe celebrating that person's life rather than the opposite?
Yeah, again, it's a great question, and it comes back again to this notion that, if your grieving process is truly your own, then performance doesn't enter the room, right? And you will have people, as an example, who will come up to you and say, like, hey, like, are you okay? Because, like, your mom just died, and, like, you're 10 days later, you're hosting a death over coffee, and, like, you're doing all these things, and, like, I'm a little concerned. Like, are you keeping things in? Like, they'll be expressing these things because of the expectations that they have. So there's definitely, and again, look, I find it deeply unfortunate that that we do have this preconceived notion. And I actually just heard it on the news this morning as we're talking, because they were talking about the fires in Maui, and they were talking about, well, people will now start to move through the 5 stages of grief, and that isn't. First of all, Maui is one of the oldest cultures that we know of, and has, despite all its tourism and things like that, there are a lot of intact elements to the Hawaiian culture that are still very much a part of their experience. So assuming that they're going to go through some kind of 5 stages of grief that Western civilization, has adopted, complete projection onto the cultures of Hawaii. But just this notion, again, that oh, it's coming up on a year, so your dad must be at this stage in his grieving process. I'm like, oh, actually, no. He did that about 6 months ago, and now we're at what you would call stage 2. 10 months in, completely out of schedule. Sorry about that. So it's unfortunate too, because the woman who wrote the book didn't actually write it with that intention. It wasn't even around death. It was around a fire that happened, and she was talking mostly to survivors of that fire who were never really ever close to dying necessarily. They would just happen to be sharing an experience where other people did die. And that's what got turned into eventually the 5 stages of grief. So again, it's a bit of a long-winded answer to say that, you know, the most powerful thing we can do for somebody we know who is in a period of what I would call active grieving is to allow them to do that in whatever way they choose, and just be ready to support in any way that you might be invited to do so, should you be.
Okay, thank you for that. I will close with one final question, if I may.
Of course.
It is very possible, given what I will eventually title this podcast episode, that someone may find it who is actually in that process right now, meaning they are dealing with their own death. If you could give them perhaps any advice or suggestions, what would you say to that person who's listening right now?
Don't do it alone is going to be the recurring thing that comes back. Don't do it alone. Allow those who you love to receive the gift of your death and dying. One of my mentors, often frames it in this way, where he says, we have this misconception that when we are dying, that it is our death, when in fact our dying belongs to other people, because they are the ones who will carry the experience. They are the ones who will carry the energy and emotion. They are the ones that will have to navigate life after we've died. And so can your death be of service? Can your death be in service? We are all going to die. Like, I don't know about death and taxes, because there's plenty of businessmen who bypass taxes. They've found ways to get around taxes, right? They're not getting around death. And so that's the one thing that we do truly all share. And the question becomes, can we see it as this thing to fight? Or can we see it as this thing to share and to learn and to grow from?
Great answer. Thank you. Paul, is
Yeah.
there something that I should have asked you about today?
I love this question. I mean, I don't know. The answer is no. I think this has been a beautiful conversation. I do want to commend you for opening up spaces to have these, what I call dangerous conversations, because they are so against the societal norms that most people don't know how to navigate them. And this has been deeply nourishing for me. And I hope that if it has even helped one person who happens to listen to this, then our time will have been well spent.
Well, I think you've helped me, so
Mission
that's
accomplished.
achieved, isn't it? Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that's great then.
If people want to get in touch with you or hire you, where do they go?
Yeah. So the best place is either one of two places. I have my website, which is huMENity. That's humanity, but with an E in the middle. humenity.co. And I'm also primarily on Instagram as Living Wisdom. And in between the word living and wisdom, there's 2 underscores so that they can find me more easily. But there you have it.
Paul, thank you for being a great guest today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.